All right. Hey, everyone. My name is Stani from Aave, and basically today I'm going to do a presentation about lean DeFi and basically how organic growth can be compiled, and also kind of like delving into basically the DeFi today and how the value in DeFi is accumulating, and also in the topic of the so-called yield farming. So basically, the idea today is kind of like look at the story of Aave and what we're doing, and how we have accumulated growth since our launch during January to this point, and also kind of like how we're going forward in this kind of like an ecosystem where liquidity rewards are playing a very significant role, and also changing the dynamics within the space. And part of that we will see kind of like, are these liquidity incentives that we have today, are they actually what are needed and sustainable? And if not, what could be a alternative way to have sustainable incentives? To start with quickly, I want to introduce a bit of Aave and what we're doing. So in essence, we started a few years ago. Our very first product was ETH, which was basically decentralized lending protocol on Ethereum, and that was the very first one. And since last year, we have been building a more liquidity pool centric lending protocol, and that was basically launched on January this year. That's the Aave protocol. And the idea of Aave protocol is that you as a user or depositor can basically deposit different kinds of assets into a global reserve, which is held on smart contracts, and you're earning interest on those assets. And then that liquidity can be consumed by borrowers borrowing against their collateral. So when you are depositing, you're getting a credit line, and you can basically borrow against that. And one of the kind of interesting things that we have in the Aave protocol is that we're also not just thinking about how to lock value inside of a protocol, but also how you could reutilize that value. And we have done that basically with the use of flash loans. So in essence, as Aave is a protocol, it doesn't mean that we have only one money market, but the idea is that there's multiple money markets. So there's different kinds of collaterals and assets that can be deposited with their own risk preferences. And the idea in the future is that anyone could actually create their own money market with different kinds of assets. So if there will be in the future, for example, tokenization of real assets such as real estate, there could be a money market where those real estate assets could be used as a collateral and borrowed against. And typically, the depositors are depositing stable coins such as DAI, USDC, or USDT, and getting in return A tokens, which are interest-bearing tokens, and essentially giving a global savings account for the users. So we launched this year, January, and like one of the metrics to measure growth in the decentralized finance space is pretty much the total locked value. So kind of like DeFi space is a pretty new thing. For many, it might not be. I mean, some of the instruments that we have in the space are pretty much reflecting the traditional finance. For example, what we are doing with the lending and borrowing, it represents kind of like a money markets, and liquidity pools are, for example, the Uniswap style or Balancer style Uniswap pools are basically market making liquidity. But as this space is kind of new for us, the developers and makers, what's interesting is that we always create terminology and narrative, and one of the narratives is basically how much value you can lock into a smart contract. And basically, Aave started with pretty much zero. So every protocol starts from zero, and kind of like our story and growth story basically began in January when we launched, but there was a lot of kind of like brand exposure and getting your community to know what basically you're building and building this expectation. And that's kind of like the part of this organic growth that kind of like many do forget as well. So it's not just basically that you launch in one day and the next day you actually have a lot of growth. It actually has a narrative behind it, and we have built that narrative for a few years. So what's interesting here is that we, since 6 months of launch, we have roughly 120 million locked value in the smart contracts, which is pretty interesting and kind of like in line with the growth of the DeFi in the current state. And there's like different reasons like how we have grown, and also kind of like how we have to grow in the future. We're going to go through. In terms of like the other metric that you can measure growth is basically the market size of your product. So what's interesting is that in the DeFi, this is a graph from DeFi Pulse, and there's different kinds of protocols and instruments. For example, you have lending, trading, and derivatives, and they're all measured with the same metric. But I think like more accurate metric for us is what is the market size and how big it is. And currently we have a market size of 145 million USD worth, which means that it's the locked value that you have in the smart contract, so how much people are trusting, but also the borrow volume. So it's a combination supply and borrow volume. And most of the assets that we have are that basically yield highest interest is basically stable coins. So it's pretty common that you're depositing certain different asset and basically you're borrowing another one. And one of the interesting things how we achieved a lot of growth is that we're trying to be very agile in terms of like what assets we are listing. So we're trying to look different kinds of communities and how those communities have grown their own community and build their own narrative. And that basically gives us, based on our risk parameters as well, but the narrative itself gives us kind of like ability to list very interesting assets that have communities backing them up. One of the examples is, for example, the Link community or our own very own community that is holding the Lend token. And being able to deposit those assets and borrow stablecoins against them brings a lot of value. And that's one of the use cases there. So kind of like what we are trying to do is that we are trying to be very agile in terms of listing and basically looking at how these different assets fit our risk framework. And one of the interesting part of our risk framework is that even if the assets is not in the same comparison, for example, that is more mature, we can always tweak those risk parameters that basically the such as, for example, loan to value ratio, or for example, the liquidation discounts that actually they are more secure to be kept in the protocol. So that's like very important part, like how and what helped us to grow until this stage. And of course, one of the coolest thing is that we basically try to, besides listing assets into the main market, we try to create new markets and opportunities. So one of the things is that these different assets, they have their own risk parameters. And basically what we can do is that we can create completely new money market with their own assets, basically with their own profiles. So let's say if we know that you can provide liquidity into Uniswap or Balancer, and you get in return those liquidity providing shares, those shares has value. But on the same time, and that value could be used, for example, as a collateral, but at the same time, it poses a bit of additional derivatives and systematic risk, because basically, if you provide ETH and USDC in 50-50 form into Uniswap or Balancer, what's interesting is that the value is the underlying tokens that you provide, but there's also additional smart contract risk, because you need to trust Uniswap or Balancer as well. So basically what we have done is that we are creating new money markets where we take into consideration these derivative tokens, and we allow users to use them as a collateral. And what that helps us to do is we can grow our locked value, our market size. And technically what's interesting here is that we are actually using the very same infrastructure, the smart contract infrastructure on the main market, and replicating it into a new market. And we only need to basically create new price fee providers that we are auditing with our auditors, and that way we can fairly quickly create new markets and opportunities, and that grows the TVL and user base. And if we imagine a world where there will be more and more tokenized assets, and especially real estate assets, you kind of want to have this separation of market, because then you can separate a bit of the systemic risk and custody risk in different markets and still scale. So that's very important part of our strategy, and I think that will be something that we will see quite extensively growing in the next year or so. And of course, in terms of like what's coming up, we are creating new money markets. There's going to be multiple new ones that I can say at this point. The one that we are already announced that we're launching pretty soon is the token sets market. That basically means that you can, if you hold your portfolio in different kinds of token sets, that means that you lock their value, and you basically aren't using it any other way than actually locking it there and being long on those assets. And what we are doing at Aave, we basically allow you to use those token sets, those locked value, as a collateral, or even lend them out at Aave. So basically, it creates a lot of new DeFi opportunities in terms of composability as well. And that also kind of like brings the value back into the Aave protocol, and that's like pretty interesting stuff. And of course, like token sets market is what we're pretty much launching quite soon, but there's other money markets that we are working in parallel that basically allows you to use different kinds of tokens as a collateral in Aave. So that's a pretty interesting way. And we will see, like, what's interesting here, that it's kind of like piling up the total locked value, because if you're supplying into Uniswap, you're providing value there, locking value there. And if you're using those liquidity shares in Aave, you're locking value in Aave, and you might borrow against from Aave and use it somewhere else. For example, you might basically farm in Balancer, and that's kind of like the neat idea of this kind of like composability in DeFi. And whether it's kind of like good or bad, it really is a question of risk management, and the multiple strategy allows us to basically mitigate and create different kinds of risk and reward profiles, which is very interesting, especially if you look at the approach from the institutional side. Speaking of composability, another key organic growth factor for us has been definitely the amount of integrations we had since this date. So our protocol, since we launched, there has been dozens and dozens of different kinds of things built on top of Aave or integrated. For example, you could deposit your funds through my Ether wallet directly into Aave and borrow and open a credit line and borrow stable coins, for example, as well, or borrow some other assets. And also you can do the very same through Argent as well. And currently, actually, we're paying for the gas cost of the Argent users who are depositing into Aave. So that's pretty cool stuff if you want to try very easy, accessible DeFi and Aave experience. So all of the things that has been built, some of them are in hackathons, some of them are just integrations, but this is all very organic way to bring more value into the ecosystem. And we see Aave protocol as kind of like an infrastructure product. We have a user interface, and we're very proud of it, and we have put a lot of effort in that. But we also know that like our very major work is actually the underlying system, which is the smart contract system that holds the liquidity, and we're focusing on that. So we're trying to kind of like create an ecosystem where liquidity can be plugged in or plugged out with our smart contracts, and that's why these partners that we have and the project that has been built on top of Aave, these are very valuable for us, and this is maybe one of the key reasons we have grown a lot. So we always kind of say that everyone is part of the Aave fam. And of course, we've seen a lot of more institutional side basically interested in the protocol, and we see, for example, that usually if you are using more secured methods to store funds, such as, for example, Gnosis Safe, what happens is that you're putting a lot of effort in the security, and basically you might be more from the institutional side. And we have seen a lot of growth in the storage of A tokens in the Gnosis Safe. And A tokens is the token that basically interest-bearing tokens that you get when you deposit funds into the protocol. So this chart very much replicates like the growth we had, and we're pretty amazed by this chart. And actually, if you think about like A tokens in general, they're kind of like automated treasury management for you, because you could pretty much buy A tokens, AUSDC or ADAI from the market, or deposit the underlying token to Aave and get the A tokens, and those A tokens are increasing in value straight in your address, which is the kind of like a cool part because of the 1:1 ratio. That basically means that you have already automated treasury management that fights against the USD inflation. So that's a very neat way to handle your treasury, especially if you're institution, or even if you're not, then you don't have time to manage that. It really reduces, for example, your costs, such as gas costs. So yeah, like one of the things when you're looking at organic growth and what you want to achieve, like you really need to think about the users, and that's what we're doing all the time. So we have different kinds of user profiles in Aave, and we're always trying to benchmark a bit like why people are using us, especially when we are in a field where liquidity is very competitive, and especially like you get a lot of rewards for liquidity, and it saturates a bit the dynamics why people are depositing in different protocols. In this kind of space, it's very important that you have very diverse set of reasons to use you. And of course, like the main reasons that people are using Aave is that they want just to earn, or might be that the current systems that they're using aren't efficient for them. For example, they're using DeFi for that reason, or they want to access 24 kind of like they want to have 24 access to industry leading yields. So for some people, for example, they want to get yields not maybe in form of liquidity rewards, but actual yields. But it really depends. And of course, the direct access to money markets and taking liquidity out of there. For example, you might be earning on the earning side, but you might want to sometimes exercise your credit. So some of your users might not just do one side of the market, but might be users who are doing both of the sides. And this is like very key component that actually it's possible to do, so that you can use some assets as a collateral and then borrow against. And that is where we are trying to be very agnostic, that basically whatever supply side there is on most of the assets you can actually use as a collateral as well. And of course, like one of the key users are the integrators and people who build on top of Aave. So that's something that you need to always mind, that they're also users, and we're trying to basically have a relationship where we are servicing everyone who integrates us or supplies liquidity or consumes liquidity. And yeah, and our memes of course are great. So it's about also creating culture. So everyone has some sort of reason to use Aave, and like that's something that we are benchmarking all the time and trying to keep things competitive. And being competitive doesn't mean only that basically you're trying to get the highest yield, and that is not even the purpose of Aave either. We're trying to list a lot of different kinds of assets, creating new markets and providing like slightly higher risk or slightly lower risk, and tweaking the yields in different markets. But the ultimate goal is to create usability, and that's like the most important thing. And I think end of the day, people care about yields, but they don't care too much to optimize the yields, because the more you optimize, the more you lose the optimization when everyone else is doing that as well. So I think that is why, like, one of the key things for Aave has been in the last 6 months is that we are trying to find those diverse reasons why people are using us and serve them better. And that's very important. Yeah, and part of the network effects in DeFi, definitely, it's not just about liquidity. Liquidity is very strong, and that is something that we're going to discuss in a moment. But it's also about like there's this effect of people composability. So one of the interesting parts was that I was brainstorming with Mariano Conti from Maker about using flash loans, because you could not open a new vault without closing another one. So that means that you need to return DAI. And we came up into the conclusion that actually you could use Aave flash loan, borrow DAI and close a CDP, sell, for example, the BAT collateral or WBTC collateral, and open a ETH vault again and return the loan. So you can actually change your long position. And this is something that didn't exist as a tool or as a product in the market. And I asked that could someone build this thing? And David Truong, one of the, well, I didn't know the person back in then, but he basically found the discussion, and he said that he will try to build this product, and he actually created it where you can swap your collateral from ETH to BOT and vice versa. And then basically there was another user who came, Fiona, and basically she's not a basically developer in this case, but actually used the product that David built on top of Aave, and actually that uses even Maker. And what's interesting is that when that transaction happens in Maker, it generates fees into the Aave protocol because of the flash loans. And that's like interesting way to extract yields from the DeFi space with the composability into your protocol. And that's what we're doing in Aave. So this thing happened, and this shows like very interesting like human composability effect as a network effect. And that's something that we're undermining very much, especially like today. And I think this is a very important to keep always a strong aspect of that's how we see it. And yeah, and the flash loans itself, like you could see, like it's just a feature in our protocol, but it's the consumption side is pretty good, especially after the Black Thursday. So what it means that you could actually borrow without any collateral. And what happens for one Ethereum transaction? So what happens is that you can do different kinds of composability things without actually having any capital up front. And one of the examples is DeFi Saver. So when you're closing your CDP, a Aave flash loan is used. And some of the flash loans are pretty big. There are hundreds of thousands of DAI, for example, and you can pre-leverage your flash loan, your wallet as well with DeFi Saver. So it just shows kind of like how important the composability, and all of these relationships has been formed kind of like with friendships as well. So the human composability has been very important for us. And yeah, so now we're basically moving to the interesting, or the kind of like the most recent part of the DeFi ecosystem, which I call kind of like the Aggregatify, where basically the dynamics of the incentives are changing, especially in terms of like yielding or lending, or the automated market making protocols. And what we are having here is that we see models where tokens, or so-called like equity, for the lack of better word, is used to basically change the dynamics and incentivize liquidity providers to bring more locked value and to bring more usage. And that has basically formed a kind of like a new hobby in the space, where as liquidity is seen as the network effect, basically the liquidity providers are jumping into the DeFi field, or they already are, but they're getting more exposure and basically farming those tokens by providing liquidity. Now, it has been very interesting because like there's a couple of things related to here is that the farming has been quite extensive and very short term. So like when liquidity providers are coming and farming, especially with large amounts, and we're talking about whales, what basically has happened is that many liquidity providers who started out basically noticed that actually they're not earning that much of this so-called equity or tokens. And because of the reason that more bigger liquidity providers are basically receiving most of the rewards. So it's not an issue in terms of like the rewards itself, but it's just a kind of like design thing. So we need to understand always that the liquidity mining or farming is not a bad thing, but the challenge is that basically it's very experimental, and it takes a lot of time to design a good pattern. And I think what's interesting about liquidity farming is that it does attract liquidity. We have seen, for example, Compound growing from 100 million TVL to all the way to 600 million. And it basically incentivizes liquidity providers to try things that they otherwise wouldn't try, and maybe some of that liquidity will stay there parked. And it also allows you to incentivize different kinds of assets that you would normally have low liquidity or not maybe that much usage at all. And yeah, and the TVL is pretty important in terms of exposure. I think people look at things like DeFi Pulse and rank different kinds of protocols based on just seeing those numbers there. But there's also kind of issues. It attracts so-called fast liquidity for fast profits. So basically liquidity providers that are coming in and just selling whatever they're earning, because as an LP, that's part of your reward. And if you are not going to be in a long position and you don't have any reason to be, if there's no utility in the token or basically your vote doesn't have much weight in the system, and if the supply is more controlled, there's less reasons you to keep holding that particular token, especially in high market valuations. And for example, the top 10 farmers are usually farming roughly 70% of all the so-called crops, and basically that's basically what I have seen in just looking at Etherscan on the yields. And yeah, and then you might have kind of like incorrect experimental designs of the liquidity mining, where you basically incentivize your incentives are not that efficient or are going in the wrong direction. And for example, some of examples is where you are supplying liquidity and borrowing, and without the reason to borrow any other reason than actually just farm the equity token. That doesn't bring any value for the protocol in long term. And as it's seen kind of like helicopter money, it might not add the value for long term, and that value could actually vanish. So the first thing is to always understand, like, what are you trying to incentivize, where you're doing this thing. And we have been asking ourselves, like, if we would incentivize, how we will do it, and why we will do it. So what we are trying to achieve as a protocol, as a community, more or less. And I think like the sustainability is the key aspect. So if you pay a token to incentivize the liquidity issues or increase liquidity, like, will it solve anything? And also, like, what are you trying to achieve? Like, are you trying to achieve to get more short-term or long-term liquidity? And this is an important question, because as time passes and the longer the liquidity stays in the system, it basically means that your liquidity acquisition costs are going lower if you are able to get people to park liquidity and being the early adopters in the protocol for taking that risk. So actually, like, instead of rewarding liquidity providers for coming and grabbing and kind of like removing the richness of the soil, you actually need to find out how they are basically they can contribute more into the soil and that the whole protocol benefits. And that's something that we're working on Aave. And of course, the early risk takers rewarding, that's the kind of like part of the whole thing. Yeah, so it's kind of like, how would you find a organic fertilizer that actually works for your community? There's nothing wrong with liquidity mining, but it's very difficult to craft a system that it benefits your community. And you need to always think your community and ask how those incentives feel like, and find the kind of like a right path. Another important thing is that we always tend to focus on the rewarding liquidity providers, but we don't think that much on how we are securing the systems unless there is an event like Black Thursday or some kind of smart contract hack. So in this case, what's important is that what we have seen in our research is that actually you could not just reward liquidity providers, but you can incentivize the stakeholders of your protocol to stake value into the protocol and basically secure and ensure those liquidity providers liquidity in case there is some sort of like a deficit event. And that way you basically are providing more utility for your native asset, for example, that the liquidity providers are creating. And this is like very interesting way that you could actually combine something that Maker has and something that the recently we have seen. So staking is important because as the TVL is getting high, it attracts more liquidity. The stakes are also high, and if something goes wrong, there's a risk that the whole DeFi will lose its face. In that case, it's very difficult to recapitalize after that. And yeah, once we scale DeFi, we need more hedging and insurance, and that is why having a staking mechanism and way to secure the protocol is even more important than the liquidity incentives. And that creates the utility for the tokenomics, besides the fact that you are able to vote and govern the protocol. And so basically the takeaway of this talk was that liquidity provider, incentivizing liquidity providers, in essence, is not a bad thing. But I think there's a lot of work to do for everyone to basically make it more sustainable. And I'm really eager to see like how the DeFi space will continue with this experimentation. Yeah, so if you have any questions or to ask, you can always ask in the chat box, and I will basically answer whatever you have in mind. This is the Aave team in total, and we're known as the Avengers. And here's a QR code into our Telegram if you have any questions or you want to follow us and ask more stuff there. And besides that, yeah, I think it's pretty much here. And thank you everyone for watching this. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask or reach me out if you have anything you want to ask. Thank you.